The views expressed on this program are those of the producers and individuals appearing on this program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Sun Prairie Media Center staff, its video service providers, or the staff and elected officials of the City of Sun Prairie.
Hey everyone, this is Rose Daly, the City Sustainability Coordinator of Sun Prairie, and you're listening to the Sustainable Sun Prairie Podcast, the show that aspires to educate, empower, and engage our listeners in all aspects of sustainability. Whether you are a seasoned sustainability enthusiast or just beginning your sustainability journey, each episode will have something new and exciting for everyone. Let's begin the conversation for a greener community. Hey everyone, welcome back. In today's episode, we'll explore the big picture of our food system, looking at all sectors from agriculture to food business, consumers, and waste. We'll take a deep dive into what's working well, where we're seeing issues, and what you as consumers can do to support a healthy and vibrant food system in your community. Today, I'm excited to welcome Noah Bloedorn and Ben Stanger, who are both deeply integrated into the Dane County food system. Welcome to both of you, and thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Rose.
Can you both introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your work with our local food system?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. My name is Noah Bloedorn. I'm the Interim Executive Director at REAP Food Group. I am currently running a project to create a Dane County food action plan. So what that means is we've been doing literature reviews and looking at data, trying to really understand how our food system works. And over this last year, we worked on doing community engagement, so talking with people all throughout the food supply chain, understanding what their needs are, and starting to understand what a vision for the future might look like. And now we're jumping into a analysis and reporting stage. So here to talk about that kind of work moving forward.
That's a tough one to find.
Yeah, sorry, Ben.
I'm Ben Stanger. I am the founder and CEO of Greenbox Compost. I am a little bit less integrated into the food system. I'm more of a I deal with the reverse end of the food system. We compost food scraps from about 1,000 homes and businesses in the Dane County area.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to learn from both of you today. I thought we could start with a look at the big picture. Our food system is so much more than farms, the grocery store, and our plates. Can you share what sectors make up the food system and how they relate to each other?
Yeah, so when we started this food action plan, this is the question we started with is, who's all involved in the food system and who are we going to be talking to in this process? And basically what we ended up with was breaking it down by sector. So we start with agriculture, how food is produced. Then we move into a sector we call infrastructure. So this is spaces and systems where food is stored, distributed, and processed. Then we talk about food businesses. So you can think about like grocery stores, restaurants, value-added food product businesses, etc. And then that all gets us to the consumer, who is everybody in our community consumes food. And then we move on to emergency food, which is really a part of that consumer sector, but it's a large part of that consumer sector. Roughly 15% of our community here in Dane County relies on emergency food or is experiencing food insecurity. So we really wanted to break that one out and give it its own sector. And then we end with waste stream, which is something that Ben works on, and maybe a good transition to Ben.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say, that's the part that Greenbox works with is that waste stream, and that, for better or for worse, I mean, unfortunately, it kind of interacts with each step of that, of that process, from growing food to distributing it to processing to, consuming. There's always a little bit of waste there. And ideally, if things are about to be wasted, they go to that emergency food system. But if it doesn't make it there before it goes bad, that's where we step in and try to make sure it doesn't go to the landfill. It goes back into the soil.
Yeah. And I think that's a great example, like the work that we're doing on the food plan and in collaboration with organizations like Greenbox is really trying to understand how do we make improvements across all levels of that supply chain to make a more efficient, just, collaborative food system in Dane County. And I think Ben just mentioned a really great point, right, is we produce a ton of food, not just here in Dane County, but in our entire food system. And a lot of that food does go to waste. So a great way of understanding what we're doing with the food plan is looking at a sector like the waste stream and trying to align all of the different actors in that sector so that we can more efficiently move food through that waste stream, so that, first we're feeding humans who need food, then we're feeding animals, then we're composting, feeding the soil. And if we can't do that, then it has to go in our landfill. But currently, right now, as it currently exists, the largest source of waste in our landfill is food scraps. It represents about 25% of our Dane County landfill.
And would you say the food scraps, are they post-consumer or pre-consumer or both?
Yeah, I think it's both, certainly. The general stat that's thrown out there is that in the United States, we waste about 40% of the food that's produced, which is above other countries throughout the world. And then, even just looking more locally here, you could probably speak on this more than I can when you look through food waste. I mean, some of that is, prepared food that doesn't get eaten. Some of that is just the sheer amount of raw produce that gets produced. And, before it sort of, or after its shelf life gets thrown out or something like that. And some of that is just mismatched. But like you're saying, too, there's a lot of things like coffee grounds. I'm sure you work a lot with coffee grounds, orange peels, banana peels, stuff like that also contributes into that food waste stream. But I would say there's certainly enough of that pre-consumer where we can do a better job of reallocating where that waste goes so that it can feed humans and animals and stuff like that before it just gets put back into the soil or worse, the landfill.
Definitely. And we'll take a deeper dive into food waste here in a little bit. But now that we kind of understand the bigger picture, I thought we could take a closer look at each of those sectors of the food system to better understand where we're at with them and how we can improve. So let's start with agricultural production and infrastructure. What is the state of this? And are we headed in the right direction? And if not, what changes do you think we need to make?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's really where this work all starts. And I think the statistic that we throw out there most commonly is that 95% of the food that we grow in Dane County isn't for human consumption.
Wow.
It's crops like corn and soy, specifically here in Dane County, that dominate that sort of agricultural landscape. And a lot of that food, so to speak, is going to things like to create biofuel, to create pharmaceuticals, and just sort of these additive products as opposed to feeding our own community. And what we're seeing through this food plan process is a real priority to start increasing the production of food made for local food consumption. To add on that a little bit, I would say that generally, I think across the United States, over the last 100 years, this is really where our food system has moved to. It's moved to commodity crops and sort of the monocrop or corporate agriculture model. And at this point right now, I think we're seeing sort of the fragility of that system, whether it comes to economic factors like tariffs or environmental factors like climate change. We're seeing how relying so heavily on growing one crop at that highest scale is really susceptible to outside factors. And so I think what our vision is here, certainly at REAP Food Group, more broadly through the Dane County Food Action Plan, is how do we diversify the crops that we're growing? How do we focus more on things like regenerative agriculture that doesn't strip nutrients from the soil and really lead to things like runoff? That's a huge problem that we see here in Dane County. I think a lot of residents here will really resonate with, the runoff from agriculture going into our waterways and really polluting the lakes here, Mendota, Monona, Wabisa, Kaganza. A lot of that does, come from agricultural runoff. And so I think what we're trying to propose here on the agricultural side of things is an alternative to this current system. And I think we understand, obviously the complexity of agricultural systems and just wanting to make tweaks to the system so that, one, we grow more food, two, that we treat the environment better through our growing practices, and three, make sure that farmers have an economically sustainable market that they can sell into.
Definitely. And what sort of impacts does this commodity crop focus have on our food infrastructure?
Yeah, that's a great question. And something that as we go through different sectors, I think, one of the main themes that we're finding in the food action plan, whether it is through research or community engagement, is just like there's this massive consolidation happening in our economy. And actually, that's something Ben and I were talking about recently. And how that looks on the agricultural sector is we're seeing less and less farmers and seeing farmland owned by fewer and fewer people. And so what that means is sort of, I guess the means to production is being held by fewer and fewer people. And so we're seeing less of that sort of economic production or benefit going to fewer people. So that means less money here in Dane County for farmers, less money in our local food economy. But also sort of what you were alluding to, Rose, is this sort of infrastructure piece, which is really important when we talk about food, right? Like there is a whole supply chain from where food is grown to how it gets to your table. And all the pieces, whether that's, places to store food, cold and frozen storage, distribution fleets to move that food, or processing equipment to break that food down into edible versions that we can either consume or be prepared for us. And that piece, that infrastructure piece, is also being owned by fewer and fewer people. So we're seeing less access. And, in moments like right now where we're seeing a real rise in food insecurity, I think we're seeing how dependent we are on, things like corporations to move that food through us. And, this last month when we had the sort of chaos around food share benefits and just this extreme rise in reliance on food pantries and food banks, when we don't own or there isn't a sort of decentralized access to this infrastructure, it really limits our abilities to react to situations like that.
The only thing I'll say from like a less experienced maybe view of this is that also I think there's much less of a prevalence of like a farmer owner.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people who are farm laborers are just that. They don't actually own the places that they're working
right.
at. And that's where you see a lot of things like with migrant labor and stuff like that. And that's
right.
obviously a factor in Dane County, but it's also a national thing, especially, think about California with like berry growing and stuff like that. So I think it's important to kind of see, like the economic and like social impacts of fewer and fewer people owning stuff. They're just owners of land, and then also oftentimes owners of that same infrastructure, which is at a massive scale, not really made for like an individual city or individual, food shed
right.
or whatever. It's more made for, national supply chains.
Exactly.
Which, again, to your point, if there's a national problem, it becomes very brittle suddenly, as opposed to being able to, have solutions that are local.
Right. And I think why your voice matters so much, Ben, is because you represent an individual who started a company to sort of address needs locally here in Dane County that relate to sustainability, and also like plays a role in all these different sectors as you're sort of like working with, farmers, you're working with institutions, the county, the government, all that kind of stuff to ensure that, some of that waste that would otherwise go to the landfill goes into a more productive a waste stream. And I think you can speak to this too just a little bit, which is like, as our food system is being consolidated into fewer and fewer hands, like I'm sure the businesses that you work with, the individuals you work with, it relies on that individual connection.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we're seeing that consolidation, what we're seeing is a food system that's really like solely focused on profit making.
Mm-hmm.
And I think what we're proposing through the Dane County Food Action Plan is how do we create a system that also factors in things like care for the environment, care for public health, care for community building. And I think, just seeing leadership from you and Greenbox in the term of like, what can the private sector do to address some of these issues, I think is where I see a lot of hope in our community as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, to your point about consolidation and about personal connections, I mean, I don't think it's any secret that this consolidation in the the food industry is also happening in the waste industry,
right.
and it's happening pretty much in every industry in the country. And we are seeing similar, but I think less dire, because food is so important, impacts across those industries. And, for example, one of our big I just read one of our big accounts. There's a possibility that it's going to be bought by an even bigger company.
Yeah.
And so what does that mean for our contract with that account, who is a big, a linchpin of our business here in Madison. And, I don't know, my hope is that, the individual who's been very important in us being able to have a really successful program there will stay on board and keep advocating for us and show them the importance of doing this locally and spread it to their other campuses across the country and, not with us, but with other composters. And so, but that does kind of put that into question is will that survive that, acquisition? Hard to say.
Right.
And then, there's other composters around the country, again, there's a bit more who are being bought out by big waste companies and kind of just becoming part of this machine that, there's tough trends there as well. So
yeah, no, you guys are both just demonstrating the value of a bottom-up approach that we probably should be taking with our food systems. And I know that's easier said than done right now with how things have been with the consolidation, but kudos to both of you for your work. And I know we'll be discussing more of this bottom-up approach as we continue into the episode. So now that we've touched on infrastructure and agriculture and we understand the issues there and what we should start moving toward, let's talk about the food business side of things. What do our listeners need to be aware of right now?
Yeah, and I think, why this matters, I think, is exactly this conversation that we just had with Ben, where it's like, in our food system, there are a lot of really specific issues based on all the different communities that we have, but the current system is built for this like national, international scale. So what we see is that the private sector isn't able to sort of meet the corporate private sector, I would say, isn't able to meet the needs of individual communities very well. And so I think as we're talking about the food plan, the focus again here is on how do we spur local food businesses to meet the demands of the community. And so, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but it is the same issue here. And this is sort of to Ben's point earlier is it's really difficult for local food businesses to get started up and even sustain their business because of, things like inflation, but also just like the general cost of doing business in the community. And so what we're really focused on when we talk about food businesses is that cost of starting up the business, right? Overhead costs like rent, labor, and just sort of having this system for incubation in Dane County, which it feels like, from my perspective, in the work that we've been doing, there is a lot of structural support for business incubation in Dane County. And I don't know if that was an experience for you at all, but we have programs like Feed Kitchens on Sherman Ave on the north side of Madison that's really like built around allowing businesses to have space to start their business and sort of start at that food cart level or catering level before really understanding like what the market is for their product and venturing out on their own. We have, institutions at the university like the Food Finance Institute that really helps those early business owners like navigate what they need to know, what resources they connect to, all that sort of stuff. But what we're seeing is that while we have all this incubation sort of infrastructure, it's really hard for businesses to break out of that level and get to the next step. And a lot of that has to do with the high cost of rent, specifically in Madison, I would say. And I think something the food plan is looking at is like, how do we work with surrounding areas outside of Madison to provide opportunities to these entrepreneurs and really expand like that local business outside of Madison and build it into a larger system. And then it's also, this issue of high cost of labor because there's a high cost of living in Dane County as well. So those are, I think, the two main barriers to sort of that incubation and growth of small businesses here in Dane County, food businesses. And some of the solutions we're looking at are like, how can we expand projects that build out commercial kitchen space so that you can have multiple businesses all in the same spot sharing some of those costs. And then, I think we haven't done a great job of understanding how to address the labor issue, but I really think a reason we haven't been able to like figure out the solution to it is because it really stems from much larger issues like healthcare, rent costs, all of these sort of other larger economic factors that make the cost of living so high and make it sort of unsustainable for somebody to live off of the wage of, a farmhand or a prep cook or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really important, and I think, I guess to your question about were we the beneficiary of like incubation or like did we have supports like that? I think there are some attempts, and there's like a lot of startup spaces in Madison, but composting is a weird industry. There's not a lot of there's a lot of software companies. There's even like a lot of restaurants. I think there are 2 other compost companies in the Madison area, but yeah, it's just there's not a lot of incubation for that kind of thing, like for a waste hauler. There's not a lot of incubation there for that, which is it's okay. But I think you're talking a lot about like people getting a really great understanding of the market as it is, which is really important. But I think to your point about like not being able to change cost of living for people so that labor is really an issue because they need to make a certain amount of money. I think that's something where I think to really change the food system, we might have to work on changing how the market functions. Yeah. And I mean, I think there are people in places like New York City, there's certain politicians that I think are doing some stuff to really address that. And obviously, Dane County and Madison and Sun Prairie are not New York City, but I do think, we're suffering from some of the same issues of affordability that might have to be tackled in similar ways. I don't know that necessarily waiting for, like, optimizing under these conditions, like getting the food system to understand everything perfectly and function perfectly and be, like, I think in the current market might still lead to a situation where we have, 13 to 15% of people going hungry and a tough labor market for people working at restaurants and such. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I really hope we can start focusing on more is like how do we address those systemic things.
Yeah, and how do we organize around that? I see other, organizations like Main Street Alliance that are really relying heavily on food businesses to do that advocacy work at the state and national level to address some of these more systemic issues. And I think, organizations like that give me hope. And it's sort of funny to me, how really a lot of the organizing for Main Street Alliance in Wisconsin has been around food businesses. And it's sort of like...
Well, it's so basic.
Yeah, it's so basic. And I feel like, food businesses are one of those last sectors of the economy that really still has a local...
And people come together there. It's like a meeting place as opposed to like everybody working at home and everything.
Exactly. Yeah, so I think that gives me hope, right? And that doing food systems work and paying attention to food systems work in your community can really have some of these larger impacts.
Yeah, it can be like a learning ground for all those other industries that we're talking about here as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Definitely. Yeah. We love working at the grassroots level.
Yeah.
And we'll be sharing tips toward the end of the episode on what you can do as a consumer to help your local food system thrive. I did want to touch on something you had mentioned about existing small food businesses just struggling to sustain themselves. And I think back to my childhood. When I was living in Berkeley, Michigan, we had a little tiny family-owned grocery store that we could walk to. It was perfect. It was right in our little neighborhood, and that would be our main grocery store. And then they eventually went out of business, and then we switched to shopping at Meijer or Walmart to get our groceries. Yeah. And there was so much more that came with that small grocery store. We knew the family that owned it. Yep. Everyone knew the family that owned it. They would get special products for you if you requested it. And you don't see that same community connection when you are shopping at those larger consolidated food stores.
Right. Yeah. Again, in this conversation around consolidation, I think it's probably most evident in the food retail space, where, I actually meet a lot of people who talk about that locally owned grocery store from their childhood. Or, their family may have owned it or, really like longing for the days of that sort of locally owned food retail space. 'Cause like what you were just saying, Ben, like food is such this community builder and a gathering space for people. And we're just seeing that consolidation probably most clearly at that retail level. I mean, just recently, Metcalf's was just bought out. Piggly Wiggly was just bought out by a larger conglomerate. And so was Festival Foods, which was a Wisconsin-based company.
Totally.
And so, sort of to Ben's point earlier, it's sort of like, what down the line, what are the effects of that consolidation, and what it means for consumers is sort of, we see this race to the bottom where, larger companies are undercutting the smaller companies. So consumers see that lower price, but as soon as the businesses get consolidated, over time we see the rise in price for food when there's less and less options. So, I mean, I think at this point, especially post-pandemic, people are very aware of the cost of food prices rising. Yeah. And I think people need to understand that consolidation is a large part of that conversation.
Yeah. And sorry, go ahead.
And the last thing I'll just say is sort of point you were making, Rose, and a point Ben made earlier, which is like, that's the economic side of things, but there are also social things that come down the line through consolidation, and it is having less of those personal connections. It's less money being circulated in the local economy. It's, when you originally asked this question, I thought about friends of mine, Francesca Hong and Alex Lindemeyer, who owned their own restaurants that were really, that was Morris Ramen and Short Stack Eatery, which were downtown Madison restaurants. Those two restaurants were real community spaces where not only were they providing food for the community, but they were also supporting local farmers. They were also raising money for local nonprofits. And, as we see those small businesses sort of fail because of things like rising rent costs for those businesses, it really affects the entire community down the line.
Totally. And I mean, to your point about, grocery store consolidation and big box chains or whatever, I think, one issue is, if, your point about like dollars circulating in a community, the type of jobs that are available at, some big box store, again, are not the type that are going to support people, especially in a place like Madison. So you get this kind of like hollowed out center around this food system, and because of that, also these programs are subsidized by the very systems that end up being the kind of net result of them. So people who can't afford enough food end up working at places like Walmart, who then have to go to food pantries. And so it's this kind of self-fulfilling cycle again also where, we really see this disinvestment in a local community and those people are the ones who bear the brunt of it. I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, I think it's a great point.
No, that's so true. And this is a really good transition into discussing the consumer side of the food system. So in addition to what you've already mentioned, what other impacts are we seeing on consumers?
Yeah, I guess I'll step back. I think through the food plan, what sort of surprised me the most on the consumer side of thing is that across sort of rural and urban divide, across socioeconomic divides, people really say that they're not accessing the foods that they want to access. And how we ended up breaking that down is into three different factors. And basically these three different factors affect most people in Dane County, and it's time, proximity, and price. And obviously, some people are affected by all three of those factors, and some people are just affected by one. But it's very clear that in order to access the food people want to access, time is a barrier. Often that relates to how much people are working. And sort of, I would say, like the atomization of our society where food really is this communal labor. But as, society is becoming more and more atomized, the responsibility of that food labor is being distributed across more people, right? So, you're responsible for creating the food for your family, but you might not have the help of your mother your aunt, your uncle, your neighbors around you. And I think so I think time is this real shift over the last 100, 200 years in the food system. Like we've really lost the community aspect of growing food, harvesting food, processing food, cooking food, and consuming food together. And I think people, when we ask people like, why isn't that you're not eating the food you want to eat, time is probably across all demographics is probably the biggest barrier. And then obviously I would say price is affecting a lot of people right now because of those sort of inflation and consolidation factors that we talked about earlier. And then proximity as well. A lot of people throughout Dane County, whether that's rural and you don't live next to a food retail location, and you have to spend a lot of time driving to access that food, or if you live in sort of one of these food access zones in the city center of Madison, where corporations have decided not worth investing in those communities to build a grocery store. And that's places like the north side of Madison, south side, Park Street, Allied Drive community. Those communities are really struggling to find food within walking distance, within distance of a bus or public transportation, and that proximity factor is really limiting their ability to get food.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would like to add to that is just that there's this idea that kind of demand dictates supply. Like if there's a demand for something, somebody will find a way to fulfill that. And I think with a lot of these sort of things, you're actually finding the opposite, which is that, at places like, again, these big chain grocery stores, the need is always to, they want to make more money. Mm-hmm. So they'll try to charge more, obviously, but also try and cut costs. Mm-hmm. So when they have these, national contracts with places, they can kind of dictate to their suppliers, like, hey, we need to get this more affordably, which means they then make a worse product because there's only so much you can do to cut costs, get more efficient. Eventually, you make a worse product. And what the end result is that the food that people are eating from these stores are often of much worse quality than what is grown locally, just because of the imperative to make as much money as possible in that in-between step. And so nobody really asked for that. I think people want more affordable food, but I don't think at that price, especially when there is a markup on it as well. So I think this idea that, if there's a demand for like better food, it will suddenly appear. Well, we're seeing this demand here, and it's not, especially when it's like culturally relevant foods or things like that, that just, there's not a large scale national market for it. How are they going to get that into like one niche market where there's a prevalence of that culture?
Yeah, it's something that blew me away in the community engagement phase of the food action plan was really across demographics, people want fresh, locally produced food. And I thought, growing up, I was an incredibly picky eater, and like eating anything green was really foreign to me.
How far you've come.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, it's, yeah. I'll write a book about it someday. But I expected more people to sort of have that perspective of like, if they're not exposed to the types of food that they wouldn't want that type of food, but or if they don't have access to that type of food, that they wouldn't want that. But it's very clear to me that across all demographics, people understand the importance of nutritious, locally grown food, and I was surprised by that too. Our mission at REAP Food Group is to build a resilient local food system, and I'm sort of in the space where local food is constantly on the top of my mind, but it is on the minds of the whole community as well, and that really surprised me. I sort of thought this would be more niche and for more affluent parts of our community, but it's not true. I think people really understand that. And, I think as we dug deeper, the reason why people care so much about that is because of how it affects their body and their personal health. And I think the difference, there's a stark difference between, heavily processed corporate food products and locally made food.
Yeah, I think from my perspective as a consumer, I can definitely relate to the three factors you had mentioned, time, money, and proximity. For for struggling to get what we want. And I think all of us, like you said, agree that we want fresh food, we want healthy food, nutrient-dense food that's good for us and for our families. But when you think about what's available to us, farmers markets are amazing places to meet the farmers, build that community, access that fresh local food that was grown down the road. But farmers oftentimes have like, one market stand once a week, and you have to build that into your schedule. And we know how busy we are. And sometimes it comes down to, I ran out of time, I missed the farmer's market, guess I have to go to Walmart or another big store to get the produce I need, but it's not going to be as nutrient dense. And I see so many issues like that. Or having a local co-op, prices are going to be higher there, but you're getting organic products or locally grown products. But it always just comes down to the consumer choice of, I ran out of time, or my paycheck is smaller than it was last week. I need to just like get food so my family doesn't go hungry, and I just have to choose this option. And I feel like we see these big corporations almost like they're trying to help us by offering additional services like curbside pickup or grocery delivery through like Uber Eats or whatever is doing that service. But at the end of the day, I feel like that isn't helping us achieve ultimately what we want. Maybe it is going to save us some time, but it's not necessarily the time that we need to achieve what we want, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it feels like sort of two things came to mind. One is like, what can we do, sort of the people and institutions that are working towards building this local food system to create the environment that makes it easier to access these foods. And when I say that, what I'm talking about really is infrastructure and subsidies for food, for local food production. And some people might not like hearing that subsidy word, but I think the reality is, and Ben's maybe laughing because he understands how subsidized our food system as it currently is, and how much corporate commodity agriculture and food retailing relies on those subsidies. I see our work at Reap Food Group now moving forward as really, how are we advocating to siphon off some of that subsidy money towards a better food system, towards a more local and regionalized food system, so that we can build back that infrastructure, so that we can better store, process, and distribute that food to make it more accessible. But then there's also this other hand, which is cultural. And a part of the reason why food is so hard to access right now is sort of what I was talking about related to the atomization of our society, and this this priority of cheapness and convenience. I think that's been the focus of our food system for the last 50 plus years, and that's exactly what we've gotten. And it's hurt our communities, it's hurt our local economies, it's hurt our public health, it's hurt our relationships with each other. We have to start as individuals and as a society prioritizing things outside of price and convenience. And what that's looked like in my personal life is really relying on community, right? Building connections with farmers. Me and my friends for the first time this year, through a mutual friend who is a farmer, started growing our own food on some excess land that they had, right? Bringing together friends for meals so that you're sharing that labor of preparing a meal. And sort of these cultural things where maybe you have a friend who has the money to buy food but not the time, and maybe you have time but don't have the money to access the food you need. And so it's this sort of mutual aid approach of coming together as a community to grow, harvest, prepare, and eat our meals together, so that we can sort of address some of those communal needs. So I think it's a both and certainly, like, not any one individual is going to have the weight of this change on their backs, but it's sort of, how can we change policy so that we can change the system we work within, and then how can we rely on one another to make the best out of the current situation that we're in.
Absolutely. Yeah, we need a really big mindset shift here. When you mentioned, like, one of you had time, one had money, how can you bring those together? It reminded me of when I was in college, and there was a local farm in our community. I lived up in Houghton. I went to Michigan Tech, and this farm offered a CSA. That's community shared agriculture. And we really wanted to be a part of this. We were like, we want this locally grown food, but we're also broke college students. So we reached out to the farm and we said, hey, we really want to participate in your CSA, but can we give you our time instead of our money? Like, we will volunteer at your farm every weekend for like 5 hours every Saturday. And they were like, yes, we would love your help. And I loved this arrangement so much because we got to really learn more about their farm operations, and we felt a deeper connection to the farmers, to the community, and to the food. And when you have that connection with food where you're like essentially nurturing the food to grow throughout the growing season, then you're less likely to waste food. You're going to make sure all of that gets consumed by you or by your friends. And I think that just goes back to your point that we need to like go back to this time of not focusing heavily on convenience or price and focusing on building that community, because that will benefit every aspect of our life.
I just recently went to Morocco, as I was telling you to before this, and one of the most kind of interesting or like jarring things for me was just like how communal and how social everything was there. From morning till dawn, people are on top of each other in a good way. Like just, you know, like constantly chit-chatting. There's so much like touching, hugging. And then like comparing that to how I live in the U.S., which is like there are days when I don't see anybody. You know, when I'm working from home, I'm just like, wow, I forgot how to talk to people. And then also the way that they grow food is similar to that, where, you know, water is so scarce there, and so they have these, you know, oases with these little tiny family plots of date palms and corn and like alfalfa for animals and stuff, and it's all intermingled and it's all family plots, which is great, except for they're running low on water. They're, you know, like climate change has really hurt that part of, you know, their agriculture, and I think that's one of the things that I think is really important, is this idea that like there are a lot more people on the planet than there were 50 years ago, and because of the way we've been living, the climate is changing quite a bit. So I think and there were flaws in the food system prior to, you know, the advent of all this. So I think one of the things that I really think about is like there were some really good things that were happening in the past, but also we have new challenges now, and there were big issues, you know, related to class and race and things like that within the food system. So I really am always wary of hearkening back to like a golden age of the food system. I think it's really great to pick and choose from that and from, you know, some good stuff that we have now,
for sure,
to meet these new needs and to really, you know, create something new and better. Like there has to be a future that we're looking towards. And I think a lot of people, when they hear about the issues we have now and they think about some really great stuff that they experienced in the food system in the past, they're like, we need to go back. And I think that's a really key thing is, number one, we can't, and number two, we shouldn't want to. There has to be like the next step.
I think that's an amazing point, because I do hear, you know, a lot of certainly older people working in the food system space talk about going back to how things were, and I think the future is sort of a combination of this current system and that older system, and it's all about
hopefully something new.
Exactly, yeah, and something actually, you know, something I really dream about because of my personal experience also working on a CSA farm where you're trading time for food, or trading money for food based on what you have access to, is, you know, that we're working less. You know, it blows my mind how much people talk about time as a barrier to eating the food they want to eat, and I think, and it blows my mind how much labor is an issue for local food production, and so I hope we can spend less time in the future like working at our desk jobs, and more time with our hands in the soil, connected to nature, connected to our food, and connected to each other. Exactly. Yeah.
Agreed. Yeah. That is the fantasy I have in my mind. I hope it's not a fantasy for much longer. So this was a really good discussion on consumers, and I think this is what really hits home to our listeners the most. But before we leave this food system conversation, we have to touch on food waste. So who would like to kick us off here?
I'll take a swing at it. So we work mostly in food waste. We compost food scraps primarily. There are other waste streams that we work with. We have had kind of a program with Sun Prairie where we composted the paper towels from the administrative buildings here. So there's other kind of interesting avenues like that. But no, I mean, food waste is interesting. As I said, when Noah first kind of introduced the whole food system, is that at every step there is some wasted food. And ideally we want to make that smaller, but especially when it comes to preparing food and, especially preparing food, there's going to be waste. We're not going to eat the orange peel. Probably not going to chew on the coffee grounds. So at some point, bones and things like that, there are things that, could end up in the landfill that we really want to keep out of the landfill and send back to the soil. And so that's where we step in. But I think, one of the interesting things to think about is, or one of the interesting reasons to compost is not only that soil aspect, but also, the landfilled food waste as a contribution to greenhouse gas in the form of methane, which is a very, very potent one. I think depending on your timeline, it's like 14 to 100 times more potent. I think we kind of land on calling it 28 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so it's a great way to kind of hit a bunch of facets of this kind of multi-crisis we're talking about, which is climate change and access to food and soil erosion and things like that, and to engage with it at a level that is accessible to most individuals. Everybody eats, and pretty much everybody, unless you're only eating out, has generates some sort of food waste they have a say in, and so being able to take action on that one little thing, I think, is really powerful, because it allows you to kind of think about, as we were saying, more broadly with this food system and like the whole economy, is that there is a way to impact this even at a small level, with just doing something. There are a bunch of free ways to compost in Dane County, so it really can come down to like what you're doing at the CSA, just like taking action on this thing. And I think that's a very liberating point of view when these issues feel so out of your control. But on the flip side, there's so much that does that kind of represents what we're talking about with the consolidation. Everything, waste industry is also being consolidated, as I said before, and there are a ton of places outside of Dane County where you can't really compost. You can compost in your backyard, but if you're renting an apartment, you probably can't do that. You could buy some gizmo thing that kind of blends your food scraps and dehydrates it and call it compost. But there's so it just kind of representative of all these issues and possibilities and the kind of greenwashing ways that people try to deal with them. So I think it's really a great lens to view a lot of stuff with, and a great practice venue for these broader issues that we're talking about. To kind of, it's like training wheels. You can kind of get good there and take it somewhere else.
Right. I really liked your point about us having control over our food waste. I feel like in the food system, we feel like we don't have control. We can't control the grocery store prices. We can't control where my grocery store is in relation to where I live, but we can control what we do with our food waste. So I think that's a really good point to bring up. And I also see so much opportunity with food waste to help solve other problems in the food system. So for example, using compost and food waste to improve soil health for the farms that grow our food, but also using food waste that's collected to feed animals. And then that's less commodity crops you have to grow to feed the animals. So I love the opportunities here. I love that we have a lot of power as individuals over food waste. But yeah, I'd love to hear other thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think if I were to like break down all the ways that people can be involved, I'd probably go back through the sectors. But I think just the general statement I want to convey is like food systems, from my perspective, seem to be this like really democratic / like make it up yourself way to participate in your community. And so it's sort of like accessible however you need it to be. And there's many ways to be involved. There's many levels, whether you have money to like, participate, or if you have to do everything like on a budget. There's a lot of ways to get involved. But I think what I would recommend, like first and foremost, is grow your own food as much as you can. Whether that's just on your balcony in an apartment or a garden plot in your community park, or if you can venture out to a farm and like volunteer your labor like you were talking about, Rose. I think just getting your hands in the soil and growing your own food really changes how you view the whole system. And I think that really changes the game. And I think just on the opposite end of that is also get involved with your food scraps. Understand like what happens after you eat the food and how that material is all a part of this larger system, whether you're feeding yourself or feeding animals or feeding the soil. It's this big cycle that all plays with each other, and having a role to play on either end of that really, I think, helps you understand how this whole system works and what our role as humans is in it. And then I think in the in-between, it's all about, voting with your dollar and really supporting, the local farmer, the local food businesses. Get to know the people that are doing that work for you when they're producing or processing food, and really build community around it. And then I think, the other really easy thing is eat with people. Like participate democratically in eating, and take real pride and joy in that act, which I think, like, for me has always been like, at the end of the day, sharing a meal with people is sort of why I do the work that I do. And it's where I find the most sort of like hope and joy and energy to keep doing this work. And I just like, if I could just say anything to people, it's like, invest in that, really. You won't be disappointed at the sort of fruits of that investment. And I think, I think that's really worth it. And then I'll say, maybe I can't say this. Maybe we have to cut this. I was going to say you should support local nonprofits. I'll say that.
You can say that.
Okay, cool. You should support.
Leave that all in.
Yeah.
He didn't want to break the rules.
Yeah, you should support local nonprofits who are doing this work, local businesses who are doing this work too. And I think investing, if you have that sort of capacity to invest your dollars in making sure that we can build out this local infrastructure so that our food system represents our values.
100%. And one thing I'll add, sometimes people feel like if they can't be perfect at something, they shouldn't do it at all. And I see that a lot in the sustainability space. But I would say, if you're someone who is struggling with maybe the money piece, you really want to shop at your co-op or your local grocery store, but you can't always afford the food there. It's okay if you can only make it there once a month to buy a few key items. That's going to be making a difference. You don't have to go all in and, only shop there from now on. It's okay if you miss your farmer's market a couple times, but if you can make it there, 3 times in the summer, that's going to be making a difference in your community that otherwise we wouldn't be seeing. So even if you have to start small with very small changes or voting with your dollars in small ways, it's still going to make a really big impact.
Yeah, I guess the one thing I want to say is that, I think also there's this real bias towards voting with dollars, which it definitely has a place. But again, if you don't have a lot, or if you just look at kind of there's all these small brands that start off with really great goals, and they're local and organic and all these things, and eventually, because of this consolidation we are talking about, they end up being owned by one of those huge brands, and you just end up with this bifurcated system where they have this organic, natural, lower ingredient list, more, closer to the earth ingredient list item, and on the other hand, they have, full of processed stuff and there's this bifurcated system that kind of ends up feeding the same process that we're talking about. So, I think really, it's the time thing that we've all been talking about. It's and energy and just going to the CSA, but also focusing on advocating, finding people who can make decisions in government and pushing them to do that will kind of force the system to reflect kind of these values that a lot of people want more broadly than I think is represented in the options that are currently available to us. And that's the other thing, is that if you want to vote with your dollars towards a food system that's available that represents these values, a lot of times there's not an avenue to vote with your dollars for that sort of thing because of these limitations that we're seeing. If I want to vote with my dollars for a local grocery store next to me, and I don't live next to a local grocery store, there's no avenue to do that. And so I think that I really want to push just thinking outside of purchasing. Yeah, I think it's really important to support local businesses, and I think local is definitely key in that. Like, I can go to the restaurant and I know I can see the person who owns it cooking there or whatever, you know. But with some of these other products and things, it's not really a viable option. I think really advocating loudly for that at key points is important.
Absolutely. And we have a full episode on how to effectively advocate at the
Nice.
local, state, and national levels. So go ahead and give that a listen.
Nice.
I think one other piece I'll add here about consumer action. So Noah, you had mentioned like enjoy your time with food, your meals. I recently came across the concept of the 5-hour meal. Have either of you heard of that?
No.
You invite your family and friends over and you commit to preparing a meal together from scratch. So if you're going to make a pasta, you make it from scratch.
Nice.
And then you make the pasta sauce from scratch too. And so you make your whole meal together from scratch. Then you all actually sit down and enjoy the meal. And you're not watching TV. You're not on your phones. You're like having an actual conversation. You're engaged with the food you're eating. You're aware of that. And then when you're done, you all clean up together. And if you do this, it typically takes 5 hours.
Awesome.
And I love this idea. I know it can be a struggle for us when we're battling convenience and not having enough time. And you know, this might be something you have to build into your schedule, but I love the concept of this because it hits so many of those points. You could be picking up the ingredients together from your farmer's market, and then you can make the food from scratch, and maybe someone's learning a new skill. Like, I didn't know how to make pasta, or like, what's this appliance? I've never used it before. How does this help us prepare this dish? And then you get to have that community connection and bonding over food, and then you get to clean up together, and maybe that's, you all take your scraps out to the compost together.
Yeah.
And I love this concept. So I would encourage people, especially right now, we're going into the holiday season, maybe make this part of your holiday celebration. Maybe invite everyone over a few hours early and you can prepare some food together.
I love it. Yeah. I'm gonna do that.
Sweet. Yeah. We've done a number of dinner parties through the work that we do, and it is sort of, I haven't heard of the 5-hour meal, but it's the same concept. And there's another organization sort of internationally, but also here locally, called Slow Food, that's really built around that. And I just think, yeah, I couldn't recommend it more. I think it's the best way to spend your time with friends and family.
Absolutely. I also have this dream, and I hope I can achieve it someday, but I want to be the person who makes all their own bread at their house.
Nice.
And who like makes their granola bars at their house. And that helps with so many things. You're going to have healthier food, less waste in your house, and your family will see more value in the food because it was prepared by you by hand. I want to get to that point, but I feel like I don't have the time or even the money to like buy all those ingredients. But it's a dream I have, and I hope a lot of us can get to that someday.
I hope so too. I think you just got to find the right people who can show you the way.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, I want to be the sourdough person.
Sweet.
And then you can share your sourdough starter with like all the
Yeah.
neighbors. Like, that's like the vision,
Cool.
you know?
Sick, yeah.
It's going to happen. I see it in your future.
Awesome. Well, do you guys have any other actions to share with the listeners or any concluding thoughts?
There's two things I want to throw out there. One, there's this really great organization that touches on a lot of this stuff called the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and that's informed a lot of my understanding of this, especially the consolidation of grocery stores and things like that. Really awesome. And then any other knowledge I have about this is from a book I just read called Barons by Austin Frerick. And I definitely recommend that for people who are interested in this more broadly and like all these trends we've been talking about. It's not a super long book, and I definitely think it was, illustrative of all these things. Yeah.
Awesome. I'm going to check that out.
Yeah, I'll just shout out the Dane County Food Action Plan. If you Google that, you can find a UW Extension website that sort of talks about the work that we've been doing and how to get involved. Look for it in spring of next year. We'll have the finished plan, and we'll start having, laid out goals and recommendations for us to start doing this work here locally. And then also just shout out to Reap Food Group for doing this work and giving us space to talk about food systems and start building a local food system.
Awesome. And I will link all of that in the show notes along with a link to Greenbox too.
Sweet. Thanks,
all right.
Rose.
Well, thank you guys so much for your time. This was an
thank you.
awesome conversation.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
All right. We'll see you next time. Bye, everyone. Thank you for listening to Sustainable Sun Prairie with your host, Rose Daly. I hope you enjoyed this episode and uncovered something new about sustainability. As always, you can subscribe to our podcast and listen anytime on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and you can listen live on 103.5 FM The Sun, WLSP-LP, and on demand on the Sun Prairie Media Center app. For links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as our contact info, please visit the show notes. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.